Alrighty, so I'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Ewan. Today, I'll be presenting my master's research, which I recently completed in partnership with Western Washington University and Mount Rainier National Park. And that work is entitled Glacial Loss and Threatened Fish, the Future of Mount Rainier's Cold Water Bull Trout Habitats. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that this work was conducted with respect on the ancestral and present day tribal homelands of the Cowlitz, Muckleshoot, Nisqually, Puyallup, Squaxin, and Yakima people. And next slide, please. Alrighty, so to begin, alpine glaciers, which are located at high elevations in mountainous terrain, are melting worldwide as a result of climate change. And this slide here contains an image of the Carbon Glacier on Mount Rainier. So alpine glaciers play numerous ecological roles, including supplying cold water to the glacial river systems that they support. And that cold water downstream from glaciers provides key habitat for many species that require cold conditions. As glaciers retreat, though, evidence suggests that stream temperatures in those glacially fed rivers could increase. So, in a future where we're seeing increased air temperatures and consequently smaller glaciers, it's quite likely that glacial rivers will be warmer. Next slide, please. So one species that could be impacted by warmer streams are bull trout. And this slide contains an image of a very cute spawning bull trout. So similar to salmon, bull trout are culturally significant and serve as important native predators in their ecosystems. But more so than perhaps any other salmonid species, bull trout really rely on very cold conditions like those found in glacial rivers to survive. So warmer stream temperatures could negatively impact bull trout in several ways. For one, bull trout typically don't spawn until stream temperatures drop below a certain degree, and that usually happens in the late summer and early fall. So if temperatures don't drop below that threshold, spawning could occur later or not at all. And as stream temperatures increase, this also means that fish with wider thermal tolerances can move into bull trout habitats and potentially outcompete them for resources. So we have seen sharp declines in bull trout population sizes across the western states, and that's ultimately resulted in bull trout being federally threatened since 1999. So if we're seeing further environmental change caused by glacial retreat, that could certainly stress out already stressed out bull trout. Next slide, please. So these issues come to a head on Mount Rainier. Mount Rainier is a particularly gorgeous, large stratovolcano located here in Washington. It has a large concentration of glaciers, and these glaciers supply cold water to numerous river systems that the mountain supports. So these glaciers are definitely retreating, and they're predicted to continue retreating throughout the coming century. However, because of its high elevation, Mount Rainier is a little bit special in that glaciers here could last longer than in other locations around the Pacific Northwest. And these glacial rivers coming down from the glaciers on the mountain do support bull trout populations. And because they're so cold, they're really important for bull trout spawning. Sort of understanding the future impacts to cold water habitats caused by increasing air temperatures and therefore smaller glaciers is important to kind of figuring out conservation strategies. And this could be especially key on Mount Rainier, given what I mentioned about its potential to become one of the last remaining concentrations of glaciers in Washington. Next slide, please. So to that end, my project sought to answer a couple of key questions. Number one, what were contemporary stream temperature conditions in Mount Rainier glacial watersheds during bull trout spawning season? And by contemporary, I mean 2021, because that's when I collected data. Number two, how does stream temperature change in future scenarios of climate change and glacial loss? And then finally, does the amount of viable bull trout spawning habitats decrease in future scenarios of climate change and glacial retreat? And if so, by how much? Next slide. And this is just a quick slide. We're going to jump into my methods. All right. So as I mentioned, my study site was Mount Rainier National Park. I focused on two glacially fed watersheds. So the white watershed, which is on the eastern side of Mount Rainier, shown here in a map of the park, and then the carbon watershed, which is to the north of the mountain. And both of these glacial watersheds contain a bull trout habitat that's considered critical by the Endangered Species Act. And it's especially important water for bull trout spawning. Next slide, please. So as part of the field portion of my project, I collected stream temperature data in both of these watersheds. And each of these little points in the white and carbon maps are where those data were collected continuously in 2021. And these are a mixture of MPS and project-specific sites. And what I mean by that are that some of these locations are places where the National Park Service collects stream temperature every year in order to monitor bull trout habitat. But a couple, which are kind of boxed off, are those by the glacial termini, which I was really interested in specifically collecting for this work. I was super curious about the influence of glacial meltwater on stream temperature, and these could also form an important baseline before further glacial retreat occurs. And from here on out, I'm just going to focus on the white watershed just to cut down on time, but the carbon watershed is also really cool and pretty, so nothing against the carbon. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and then because I was interested in bull trout spawning in particular, those continuous stream temperature data were condensed to just September. And that's a month during which quite a bit of bull trout spawning has historically happened on Mount Rainier. And then stream temperatures of less than or equal to 12 degrees Celsius were considered thermally viable for bull trout spawning for the purposes of this project. And that's currently kind of the state standard. And then 2021 bull trout spawning locations were incorporated into the results to sort of shine a spotlight on which areas of the river are currently most utilized by fish. And I'll refer to those as reds. And a red, which we see in this picture, is a little nest that fish dig out to lay their eggs. Next slide, please. So in order to kind of look at current and future habitat conditions, I took those stream temperature data and created what are called spatial stream network models. So these models are used to predict some aspect of a stream at unsampled locations. So in my case, looking at stream temperature in unsampled locations. If you look at this diagram on the left, we see locations where actual data were gathered, and this is just a theoretical watershed, it's not the white. So these are called observations, and then on the right, we have predictions at unsampled locations that were generated by the model. So the end result are nearly continuous predictions of stream temperature throughout a river network. And one really cool aspect of these models are the inclusion of something called landscape covariates. So you can include not just the stream temperature data that you collected, but also other data points that might help further predict stream temperature. So in this case, I looked at both air temperature and glacial cover to help me represent stream temperature throughout the network. Next slide, please. Okay. So then once I had made models that predicted contemporary 2021 conditions, I was able to use those as a jumping off point to explore climate change simulations. And I did that by sort of turning the dial on both glacial cover and air temperature. So to simulate mid-century conditions, I increased air temperature by 3 degrees Celsius, and then for late century, 6 degrees Celsius. And then because we don't totally know the future of Mount Rainier's glaciers, I explored a range of options there. So I tested 20%, 40%, and 80% loss of glaciers in both mid and late century air temperature scenarios. Next slide, please. All right, so let's jump into some results of the contemporary models. Next slide. So this is a map of continuous water temperature predicted for the White River watershed in September 2021. So the mean September stream temperature here was 6.27 degrees Celsius, and the average air there was 1.49 degrees. And we're seeing an expected temperature gradient. And what I mean by that is that at higher elevations, as well as closer to glacial ice, there are colder stream temperatures. And then as the river moves downhill away from cold headwaters, as well as away from glaciers, stream temperatures are kind of naturally increasing. The entire network is predicted to be below 12 degrees Celsius, which was that thermal spawning threshold. And then we saw lots of reds. So those are shown by the bigger circles. And that's great to see. Next slide, please. Okay, and then using that model as a framework, I was able to simulate future climate change. So there's a lot going on in this slide, but I'll kind of break it down. So that 2021 map that we just saw is in that black square. And then in the center column are the predictions for mid-century air temperature, and then in the far column, late century. And those are each crossed with 20%, 40%, and 80% glacial loss. And so as we move across increasing air temperature and decreasing glacial size, stream temperature is clearly going up. But let's think about that specifically in terms of spawning viability. So in the contemporary watershed, if we remember, it's predicted to be totally below 12 degrees Celsius in September. So that's 100% thermal viability for spawning. But by late century air temperature scenarios with an 80% loss in glacial ice, so that's kind of like worst case scenario, that spawning viability was down to just 3%. So using these models, I was also able to kind of hone in on known spawning streams that bull trout historically use and figure out if they remain viable for spawning in the future. So in the mid-century simulation, nearly all spawning locations in the white did remain viable for spawning, but by late century, none of those streams were technically below that spawning threshold. And those that did remain kind of close to 12 degrees Celsius were those that were directly sourced by glacial ice. Next slide, please. So in summary, excellent spawning conditions predicted in contemporary watersheds by spatial stream network models. So that's good. However, substantial stream temperature increases were predicted in those future scenarios of climate change. And then substantial decreases in viable bull trout spawning habitats were predicted in the future. However, a few locations did seem to endure as cold water spots, and those provide opportunities for strategic conservation planning. Next slide, please. So what are some of those specific planning implications? As I mentioned in my introduction, fish with wider thermal tolerances can move into warming streams. And on Mount Rainier, the big fish that we're looking at are non-native brook trout. Those can really pose a problem to native bull trout, by outcompeting for resources and also potentially hybridizing with native fish. And so having a handle on those few streams that could continue to provide good habitat to bull trout will help resource managers really target efforts at keeping non-native fish out of those locations. And then bull trout, and particularly resident bull trout, could potentially be moved from warming streams into streams that might continue to be colder. And this slide contains an image of some field techs setting up a temperature logger, and then a very cute little bull trout swimming in the bottom left. So to wrap things up, next slide, please. I'll just talk about some next steps. So these models could be fine-tuned with additional data points, as well as additional information about the landscape, something like snowpack or solar radiation. And then this project, most importantly, underscores how important it is to collect stream temperature data throughout watersheds in our network in Washington. So stream temperature is such a key indicator of water quality, and those data collected can be used to generate models like these, or other products that help us protect critical ecosystems. Next slide. Alrighty, so thanks everyone. Just acknowledging all the people who helped on this final slide. Thanks so much for listening to me today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, questions are coming in, getting lots of applause. Thank you, Katie, for jumping in there for us.
Yeah,
appreciate it. Lots of questions. Not sure we'll have time to get all of the questions before break. Did you find that water temperature became cooler anywhere in the watershed due to increases in glacial melt entering the watershed?
Yeah, so definitely stream temperature was cooler by like those direct sources of glacial melt. That is like an interesting question in terms of, will we see like pulses in glacial melt as glaciers are kind of like rapidly retreating? I didn't really look at that necessarily. I was just kind of looking at, as glacial ice becomes less and less, will the impact of that glacial ice make for a warmer watershed when there's considerably less ice? So that's sort of what I was looking at.
Nice, nice. Another question here. Did past global warming events occur slowly enough that bull trout were able to adapt in the past to a warming climate, or have bull trout repeatedly gone extinct during warming events and then re-evolved into existence during global cooling events? Or do you think bull trout survived in the few streams left that stayed cool? And you can take any part of that question.
Woo! That's a wide ranging one. You know what I will say about that, I'm not necessarily an expert on like the entire history of bull trout, but I do know that they evolved kind of in tandem with watersheds that were glaciated. They evolved to live in glaciated watersheds. And so sometimes glacial retreat has helped bull trout and similar fish that need really cold waters, in that if we're looking at a place like Alaska, where there's a glacier that stretches all the way out to the ocean, and then it's slowly receding in towards the mountains, that's giving something like a bull trout or a salmon more and more like cold water to populate. But in the case of Mount Rainier or other alpine glaciers, where the glaciers don't really have too much further to go, you know, they're just kind of like going up more on the sides of this stratovolcano. It's not necessarily creating more habitat. So that's what I'll say to that. They evolved in tandem with glaciers.
Okay. We're going to take a couple more questions before we go to break. Do you have an idea of how thermal viability for bull trout spawning would look in October rather than September?
Yeah, I mean, streams are becoming cooler later in the fall. So, you know, just speaking anecdotally from doing spawning surveys on Mount Rainier as a technician for the park, Sometimes we're still seeing spawning happening like later in the year if it was a particularly warm summer, or if we're, it's not just temperature, right? It's also things like having enough stream flow with rain events coming down. So certainly, like, we could see the timing of spawning change in terms of thermal viability, depending on what happens with climate change. But yeah, October could definitely work.
Okay, Katie, thanks for hanging in there. And you can see these questions in here as well, but let's take one more. Hi, Katie, great presentation. Wondering if you can comment on how future increased temperature regimes may influence early life histories of bull trout, like egg to fry, survivorship, time to emergence of fry, that kind of thing.
Yes. Yep. So that is something that I do talk about in like a longer version of this presentation. But yeah, warming stream temperatures are not great for younger fish either. It's such a carefully timed life cycle that really relies on stream temperature changes occurring throughout the year. And so those changes could impact food sources for younger fish, and not so much in terms of temperature, but like if we're seeing big flooding events that are kind of mistimed with when young fish or eggs are developing, you can see scouring and that type of thing that's detrimental to young fish. So yeah, problematic.
Okay. Well, thank you, Katie. Thanks for jumping in there. Thanks for all the really good questions. And you can see some of those in the chat.